Bold. Bizarre. Terrifying. Rock Hudson, in an astonishing change of pace, stars in Seconds.
Hello and welcome back to For My Consideration, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is, where I take a request from a patron to talk about any movie of their choosing that was nominated for at least one Oscar. Today we're talking about Seconds from 1966, which was nominated for, indeed, just one Oscar, so it counts. This was requested by my patron Christoph, with some also additional support building off of that request from Jeremy Kaplan and Greg Kriebman. So thank you all for this excellent suggestion. And my guest today is a guy who hasn't actually appeared on the show before, but I have certainly admired his perspective on film for a while now.
Wow.
Member of the Atlantic Film Critics Circle. He is part of the Awards Watch family through his excellent podcast, Director Watch, with our friend Ryan McQuaid. I was lucky enough to guest on an episode about Carol a few months back, and that was very fun. Welcome to the show, Jay Ledbetter.
Admiring my thoughts on film is, that it doesn't get any better than that. That's as good an intro as you can have as far as this stuff is concerned. So no, but
Yeah.
Kevin, thank you so much for having me on as a, what do you call me? Awards skeptic? Is that the term?
Agnostic, maybe? I don't know.
Well, I watch with an interested eye, but I have the capacity to turn my nose up at it every now and then. So it's awesome to be here. We loved having you on for Carol, one of my favorite episodes that we've done on our show, our fairly fledgling show. So thank you for doing that. And it's awesome to be here and awesome to have an excuse to watch a movie I've never seen before. And especially one as kind of interesting as this one is. Certainly interesting.
Yes.
I love that
You
got like one request. It barely comes under the wire, one Oscar nomination. And then other people were like, yes, that one.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
It was building momentum on the Patreon.
That's awesome.
I figured this has to be the one. Not exactly a holiday kind of film necessarily, although it does have John Randolph, who is in Christmas Vacation. So there you go. There's a connection for you.
Good point.
But this is a really dark and heavy movie that we're here to talk about today.
A little bit.
So just to get into an introduction about the film. So Seconds is a psychological horror, sci-fi, drama, kind of all in a blender, based on the novel of the same name about a middle-aged banking executive named Arthur Hamilton who feels unfulfilled by his life, and he lives in New York with his wife Emily. Their only daughter has moved away, so they're empty nesters, and one day, while boarding a train, Arthur is given a slip of paper with an address on it, and his friend Charlie calls him, despite Charlie being presumed dead, and he convinces Arthur to go to the address on the paper with the promise that it will improve his life and get him out of the rut that he's in now. So he does so, and when he gets there, he meets with this underground company that presents him with the prospect of undergoing a very unique surgical procedure where he can assume an entirely new identity and start over with a new face and a new life, and allow the company to stage the death, like the death of his older self, that is, using the same kind of surgical operation. So it takes some convincing at first, but he agrees to do it after realizing how empty his life is, and he wakes up from surgery in the skin of a new man, Tony Wilson, and he's flown out to California to start over his new life, but as he comes to realize, just because he got rid of his old self doesn't mean that everything is magically fixed. So the film was directed by John Frankenheimer and written by Louis John Carlino, stars John Randolph as Arthur, Rock Hudson as Arthur's new identity, Tony, Salome Jens as Nora, a woman he meets in California, and Will Geer as one of the men behind the company, titled Old Man, and Francis Reed as Arthur's wife, Emily. And Seconds was a box office bomb, grossing only $1.7 million at the domestic box office, but it still scored that one Oscar nomination, which was for Best Cinematography for James Wong Howe. So let's talk about it. Seconds. Jay, this is a heavy, heavy film and a lot to talk about. Tell me your thoughts on this film. Does it surprise you at all to learn it was a box office bomb? Like, what's your relationship with even John Frankenheimer? Wherever you want to start with this.
Yeah, I'll start, I guess, as a person with an auteur-focused podcast, just sort of my Frankenheimer experience. I'd only seen The Manchurian Candidate. That's the only Frankenheimer I've seen before. And so I was familiar with Seconds. I'd never seen it before. And then as I was just perusing around before watching it, I was like, let's go check out Frankenheimer on Letterboxd. As far as like film popularity, I was shocked to see that this was actually number one ahead of Manchurian Candidate. And so I was like, so I've been missing out on something. So let's check this bad boy out. Knew very little other than, it's the third leg of the Paranoia trilogy of John Frankenheimer. And so I turn it on and I'm like, okay, I've kind of got a speed for Manchurian Candidate. It's probably going to be along those same lines, some very politically charged, but fairly traditional, I would say, filmmaking as far as Manchurian Candidate is concerned. And then you turn it on and it's like, so we're doing like some Salvador Dali interpretations of American Paranoia in the 60s. And also a movie that feels shockingly contemporary in its concerns. It feels very ahead of its time in so many ways. And it has this air of, the suburban dread that is starting to cloud over America in the 1950s and 60s. The word that comes to mind, which is an overused word and also post-dates this movie, so it doesn't really apply, but I was like, this is a little Lynchian. It's very much about kind of the evils that are underneath the apparently sublime world of suburban America, which is one of my favorite kind of things to explore. But immediately what I noticed was just like, I thought you had to have a GoPro to like track over somebody's shoulder like this camera is doing right now. And it's some incredibly impressive visual work from this film, which is, that's the one Oscar nomination it got, right? Was cinematography. Wasn't received particularly well because it is very transgressive and it is very weird, but the cinematography is kind of undeniable. And if there's one thing I do love in a movie, it's just like, give me like a really artful, heightened, elevated episode of The Twilight Zone. I'm all the way in.
Hell yeah.
And that's what this is. And that's what this is. Twilight Zone, one of the greatest television shows of all time, but it's a TV show. They had to make them fast. They had to make them cheap. And then with this one, they're like, okay, John, you've got a little bit of a track record. We're going to let you kind of do your thing, but we're not going to
cook.
Let him cook.
They did.
Thoroughly with this one in a way that can be off-putting in some ways to many people. I mean, I totally understand why this was a bomb, but I found it to be a pretty captivating watch. One that kudos to your Patreon subscribers for recommending this one, because it's pretty spectacular.
Yeah, absolutely. This film, like I said, I've known about it for a while and I was hoping to get to it eventually, but other things just went further up the list and kind of knocked this down. But thank you, Christoph. Thank you to those patrons, because this film is phenomenal. I was honestly blown away just by how well put together this is, how much it still holds up and really does speak to those very real existential fears that people face still today. I would also just note, I know I bring up Mad Men a lot on this show, but because I've been rewatching it this year and I just finished my full watch from this past month, and I have to say this speaks to so many of the same themes of Mad Men, with Don Draper's arc of just wanting to basically knock over all the pieces of his life and start over fresh because he's unsatisfied despite having everything that people tell him he should want. And I know, Matthew Weiner has said that this movie is a primary influence on Mad Men for that exact reason. But anyway, what I think I love the most about this movie is that it could be very schlocky and like just a feature length Twilight Zone episode, but instead of like making this about the procedure and like dwelling on how all of it works and going big into the sci-fi of it all. I think what, Frankenheimer and what the screenwriter do is use that as a means of exploring those very real concerns about what it means to be unsatisfied with your life, even though you have this great job and a wife and kids, the whole American dream, and I think to have this come out like in the heart of the 60s when there was so much societal change happening in America, where people were really questioning their values, after all of that pressure of conformity in that post-war era. And we see even like an interaction with like the counterculture movement later in the film in a very wild scene. I think it's very tapped into those contemporary concerns, but doing so in a way that, I don't know, it doesn't really feel like it's holding your hand through this story. Like there's a lot that's communicated through facial reactions and visuals that just say a lot about how this man is internally screaming at all times, essentially.
You want to know a very embarrassing confession for me? Mad Men, one of the greatest shows of all time, in my opinion. I love it to death. Never watched the last season. I don't know.
No.
I loved it. I
What
just
happened?
never got around to it. I don't know why. And now it's sort of like a thing where I'm like, should I just never watch it and that be a fun fact that I can bring up in conversation? I need to watch it.
And now here we are.
Yeah. And now here we are talking about a film that certainly relates to it very much. And
Yeah.
it is the one thing that did really just blow me away was, fittingly, given the kind of nature of how a film gets nominated for this episode, this type of show, was really the cinematography. It's so focused on faces and the close-ups, and early in the film it's almost framed like a horror movie where it's focusing on the folds and the flaps and the wrinkles of
Stretching
older
the skin
faces
and all that.
Yeah,
like Jesus.
And it's played so much like a horror movie. And also, as someone who acknowledges that he has a tendency to be rather vain and has an existential fear of aging, this one hit me pretty hard at certain points, and it really does hit on those ideas of, as the physical gets rejuvenated, the spiritual still remains exactly the same, right? And
Yep.
so these tendencies for wanting to return to some earlier form as a way to reset, it doesn't really exist, and that's really kind of what the movie's about. And it is. You talk about it being a hard watch from a content perspective. You talk about it being a hard watch as far as just aesthetically, it's trying to disorient you and be off-putting in some ways. But just from a thematic perspective, when you kind of get down to the nuts and bolts of what it is really saying, it can be a little overwhelming at times, because it is really showing you like, hey, it may not fully get better. There aren't many alternatives to what you're going through right now, which I think is something that rang true in the 1960s. It's something that has rang true in every decade since then, and it is certainly something that rings true in 2023.
Yeah, and there's not going to be a magic bullet.
No.
Even in the case of this being like a very expensive, life-altering magic bullet that's going to fix everything.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I think both of the actors here, starting with John Randolph in the beginning, is so heartbreaking, I think, almost immediately in establishing that emptiness he feels.
Mm-hmm.
But then when Rock Hudson takes over, what he does emotionally and going to that deep, dark place is kind of shattering, So there's truly like, so much to talk about, so much to recommend with this. I would encourage people to maybe stop the podcast now and check it out if you haven't seen it already, because we're going to talk about some things that I think would be better left unspoiled, But yeah, I feel like this is one of those films, speaking to a little bit of what you're saying of like, the older you watch it, the more it might resonate with you in ways that are uncomfortable to confront. So in a way, I'm sort of glad I finally waited until now to watch this, because I feel like if I was younger watching this, I'd be like, well, that was interesting, but I didn't really connect to it. Yeah. Now I'm like, oh, I understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is the rare case where, yes, I feel like this movie is underseen enough that you can give the alert, go watch it first, right? Because I mean, if you or I haven't seen it, then I'm sure plenty of people haven't seen it. But
exactly.
it's full of dread, and it rings really, really true in many ways. I still maintain the scariest movie I've ever seen is Synecdoche, New York, because it is just about
Yeah.
the horrors of dying, and this sort of hits that
Hmm.
same pressure point in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And is very invasive with its
Yes.
characters in a way that doubles the anxiety and the dread. So love that. Honestly, I do, because it is like this such a primal emotion that this movie too is able to get at, even though it's 50, 60 years later.
Yes.
It still evokes more of an emotion in me than most modern films today
Oh, 100%.
are able
Yeah.
to reflect in contemporary issues. So there is a quote that I wanted to read from John Frankenheimer himself when this film was coming out, talking directly about what he wanted to explore with the film. And he said, "No one seems to be satisfied with what he is today. World society lends itself to the Faust theme," which is, this is a very Faustian kind of story.
Mhm.
Everybody wants to be someone and something else. I hear it said everywhere. The lack of communications between married people is appalling. People are unable to talk to find a new area of agreement and marital accord. That's what I tried to say in seconds. Running away from life as it is only produces the same problems in different environments.
Wow. So, he was really going for a crowd pleaser with this one.
Yes, directly speaking to the masses.
As a as a married man in his early 30s whose wife went out of town by herself this weekend, maybe just a lot of conflating factors here contributing to its impact. So,
Wow.
I mean,
Yeah.
it is a movie. Even now, as I'm talking about it even more, it's starting to like flower, and I'm starting to
Mm.
even appreciate its power even further. But it's also, you talk about the Rock Hudson of it all. This is
Hmm.
a film so detached from movie star motive, right? This is a
Yeah.
pure artistic exercise that is not trying to. I don't think anybody made this movie with box office fully in mind.
No,
They kind of
absolutely not.
tricked the studio into giving them money for it, and then they made
Hmm.
this thing. And I'm sure when they saw it, the second they saw the Salvador Dali inspired sexual assault, I'm sure
Oh, yeah.
they were questioning what they had funded. But it is incredibly effective, incredibly evocative. It's a aesthetically gorgeous movie, and
Mm.
it's one that's gonna stay with me for a long time. So again, just like a real pleasure, if you can say that about this movie.
Yeah, I don't know whether to be honored by that or feel like I'm sorry that I've
Yes.
subjected this on you.
No, it is. I mean, these are some of the best watches, right? Where it's like,
Yeah,
so I'm gonna be thinking about this while I'm filling out my Excel spreadsheets this week at work. And
there you go.
I think that's a pretty cool thing to do.
Yeah. Well, I think the temptation with a film like this, where Rock Hudson is above the title here, the temptation is to just kind of focus on that. But I do want to talk about this like 40-minute first act with John Randolph, because I find that the
Oh
amount of
yeah.
tension that's built is really incredible work. Like starting with that first scene of him walking through Grand Central Station, like, and we're getting these occasional point of view shots from like this very low angle, even though like that's not his eye level. And there's this sort of disorientation through so much of that first section between those extreme close-ups on his face and this quiet sort of like ineffable discomfort he feels, and it's very palpable. And that, inciting incident of the man giving him the address, and also addressing him by name, saying like calling him Arthur, and sort of him sitting with that information on the train ride home, and then having that phone conversation with Charlie, who knows very personal details about their past that only Charlie could know, having assumed that this man was dead. It's all building how there's this like quiet desperation in Arthur that we see him going through, this feeling that life didn't turn out how I thought it would, this suburban malaise that we've talked about, how complacent his life is. There's just such a eerie tension I find in the air that is so unnerving, and again, without overtly having to have him say he's unhappy or indicating that much in the script even, but we still understand why he's feeling so lost and alone in the world because of his incredibly emotive performance, but also I think it's because of how he's just this sort of mild-mannered man, and having this banal conversation with his wife and learning that their only daughter is out of the house now, so it's just the two of them, and they have this horribly awkward encounter in bed where they're sort of intimate, but he is not responding to any of her rhythms at all. And I just find the how close we are to these people, it feels so invasive. You see the beads of sweat that he keeps wiping away, and those quick sort of cuts to all different angles on his face. It gives the effect, for me at least, of him just being trapped, because like he has nowhere to go because the camera is just everywhere.
Yeah, the first 15 to 20 minutes of this movie are truly like an experimental film. They're almost silent, and it's a lot of these very disorienting camera angles. It's a lot of extreme close-ups. It's a lot of hard cutting between fairly inane images, and there's a lot of stuff that's out of focus, and it's just, if you get on this movie's wavelength immediately, it just grabs a hold of you. And then even as it goes on and it becomes a little more formally traditional, it still totally plays. And that's how all these things kind of work, right? They'll start out a little more experimental, and then eventually you kind of have to get to a story. But it takes a while for this one to get to a story, which is not a bad thing at all, because it is, I mean, just, I turn this thing on. I'm like, okay, so it's a Criterion. So we got like, like what Harry Styles would call a movie. And then you see these images of, you're like this. This is not a person you would normally see centered in a movie. This is not a movie star. This is a guy who is sweaty and nervous and just trying to catch a subway train. And we're getting every ounce of that communicated to us wordlessly through these, again, like, off-putting is a word that I keep kind of coming back to, but that is the sensation that I feel like Frankenheimer and company are kind of trying to communicate, is just to make you feel bad and sort of awkward, and like you're not supposed to be seeing the things that you're seeing on the screen, because they're not the things that oftentimes people show you in a movie like this, especially not that this was an entirely mainstream movie, but you got a big movie star attached to it. This is John Frankenheimer. He's had successes. And then to come out with a movie like this, I think is just, in hindsight, an achievement in and of itself, getting it made. And then for it to be this artistically successful is a whole nother thing. But I just love that. I'm really glad you came back around to that kind of artistic open, because so many times when we're on like this podcast, it's like, yes, let's talk about the story. But this is a movie that requires you to talk about so much more than the story, because this movie, its power comes from the things beyond its kind of Twilight Zone-y plot.
Yes.
And it evokes so much feeling without having to have a ton of story, although it does have a ton of story later.
Some of the best stuff for me of really being very incisive is when, like, for example, Charlie's calling him on the phone and saying, "What have you got now?" Like, truly, what? And when he just solemnly is like, "I don't know."
Yeah.
What I love in his performance, and what I think he gets so right, is that John Randolph, he's not like hamming it up and trying to make you sympathize with him, even though you really, really do. But there's like such a emptiness and almost a guilt in admitting that he feels nothing, which I think is a very realistic depiction of depression and emptiness. So I admire the film for showing us the despair, I guess, and not doing too much of telling why this man would choose to undergo such a life-altering sort of procedure, because I think in the hands of a different, schlockier kind of like writer, I think, we would get a lot of like business of all the things that are piled up around him that are making him so stressed and upset. And instead we're just left with this cold sort of emptiness. Ultimately.
Yeah, the movie leaves it up to you to kind of assume what's going on beyond the walls of the movie itself, what's gone on in the past. Right. And that whole idea is very evocative. That's where kind of the ahead of its time thing comes, where it's like, okay, so we saw this with American Beauty, we saw this with Fight Club. I mean, it is really reminiscent of so many things that came after it. You certainly saw it just a few years later with The Graduate, from sort of, a different age perspective, but this kind of malaise that is hanging over people living in this environment. But I do really appreciate that about it, that it's not just, okay, so let me show you the 15 things that are bad and why he might consider doing this. And instead, it's just a general idea and an idea that I'm sure more people can relate to, which makes it an effective tactic of just, I'm frustrated with what my life has become. And that is sort of universal in ways that, oh, my wife won't change the cat litter and my son keeps getting detention or whatever. That specificity, you can kind of lose some people when you do that. And so when you start out so broadly with this idea of malcontent and frustration, you can get to a point where everyone can be like, oh, I might do that as well. And then X, Y, and Z might happen. And that is where the social power of the film comes from.
Yeah. I think anyone can relate to that feeling of being like, these are all the things that society and culture has foisted upon me as these are the things that make you happy. And then you look at it and you're like, oh, this doesn't make me happy. Is there something wrong with me? Thank you for listening to this preview of For My Consideration, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please go to patreon.com/andtherunnerup.is and become a patron. Only $3 a month will get you access to bonus episodes and early access to regular episodes. Thank you so much for your consideration.